Alright, this is Unit 4, Video 4, Mexican-American War, and this is going to be a little bit more about westward expansion as well, but it's more the practical side of it. So the war with Mexico was pretty quick and decisive. Mexico not only lost Texas, but they also lost what is today California, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and the treaty that set these new boundaries and ended the Mexican War was called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The question of slavery came up in these territories pretty quickly, and that's going to cause some problems. Southern leaders, as you might imagine, wanted the new lands to be open to slavery, while the North wanted it to be free. The question went unresolved until we get yet another compromise that had to be reached as a result. Here you can see American troops in Mexico City after they've captured the capital. And this is the Treaty of Guadalupe outline border that we got all the way up through Utah, Nevada, California. And so that was what was gained as a result of the treaty. So how did the Mexican-American War worsen tensions between the North and South? So typically when you have a war and your country wins, you have a lot of national unity and national pride. But in this case, you have more tension between the North and the South. And the main problem is the question of slavery. This new territory that they gained from the war, the question is, will it be free or will it be slave? And so as a result, you have even worse tensions between the North and the South growing. So we get this compromise of 1850 to solve the problem of the territory. Because of the land won in the Mexican-American War, this question of slavery raised in this new land. When California applied to enter the Union as a free state, the South objected. To prevent secession and maybe even war, Congress adopted 5 laws that cooled tensions for just a bit, and the laws are as follows. The first, the state of New Mexico would be established by carving its borders out of the state of Texas. So Texas would give up part of its land to New Mexico to create this new state. Secondly, New Mexico's voters would determine whether or not the state would prohibit or have slavery. So basically it would be left up to the voters of New Mexico. The third thing, California would be admitted as a free state. Fourth, all citizens of the United States, regardless of where they were, would be required to apprehend runaway slaves and return them to their owners. Those who did not abide by this law could be fined or imprisoned. And this is oftentimes called the Fugitive Slave Law, and this is pretty much the only part of the Compromise of 1850 that the South really likes. So they, for them, runaway slaves was an issue, and so Northerners, Westerners didn't matter. Free state, if you found runaway slaves in your state, you're required by law to report that and try and get them back to their owners. Many states, many people refuse to do this, as you might imagine. The fifth thing here was that the slave trade would be abolished in the District of Columbia. Slavery was still allowed to be practiced there, and this is Washington, D.C., District of Columbia, the nation's capital. It was just the slave trade, the buying and selling of slaves, that was abolished in D.C. And here you have Henry Clay, who created the Compromise of 1850. He also did the Missouri Compromise, and you have him here saying, I can't keep doing this forever. We've compromised, these lines are drawing, and so that's a pretty good political cartoon that kind of shows we just compromise after compromise. There's no real solution to this problem, and the problem obviously is slavery. So what lands the Compromise of 1850 decide would have popular sovereignty? So that was the New Mexico territory. Those voters would be allowed to vote on whether or not they wanted slavery in that territory. And then the 5 parts. Okay, so the Compromise of 1850, if you remember 50 there, has five parts. New Mexico was taken out of Texas. Okay, that was the first one. The second one, the land that became New Mexico, they would have to vote to determine whether or not they would have slavery. So New Mexico voted on the issue of slavery in that territory. The third thing, California was admitted to the Union as a free state. Fourth, the slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C. not slavery, but the slave trade. And then finally, the Fugitive Slave Act. So any fugitive slave that escaped and was a runaway slave, they had to be apprehended regardless of where they were, free state or a slave state, and returned to their owner. You don't have to know those in a particular order, those five, but you do need to be familiar at least with what they are. And why was this compromise important for the United States? Every compromise that we've seen has been important, but the Compromise of 1850 once again pushes off the real issue, and that's slavery. So the compromise is important because it really puts off the Civil War for another decade. This could have ignited as a Civil War in 1850, but this compromise was reached, and so the real problem of slavery is just kicked down the road for someone else to deal with.